Hi everyone, welcome back to Institute Professional Studies and Theme 8 in our programme, which is looking at who or what has done most for education, because the aim of this, now that you're through your PGCE and you're equipped with the knowledge, skills, experience of what it takes to be a teacher and to teach effectively, it's now about placing you in context and deepening and broadening your knowledge about the system that you act within so that you yourself can impact on that system in future. So we're thinking about all the antecedents, all the causes, all the protagonists that have contributed to the education system we see today. And we're going to take a sample of those protagonists and debate who or what amongst those has done most for education. So the protagonists in just alphabetical order, no kind of preferential order, we're going to think about are the Conservative Party, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the Labour Party, the National Education Union, technology, and university, initial teacher education. I'm going to take you on a whistle-stop tour of the ideas and the influences that each of these protagonists might have had on education we see in England, to enable you to think and yeah, have a real think before the debate kicks off proper, so that you can establish where you sit, what broaden your understanding about each of these contributors, so that you're more able to engage in that debate that we're going to have tomorrow, but also so that you can have a mini debate in your subject-based sharing group prior to the debate happening per se. So here we go. So we're going to start with the Conservative Party. I've broken this down into their influence on what is taught, how education is structured, uh, why. I'm not quite sure why I've used why, but anyway, we'll come on to it. And then who teaches. Okay, I think I was just trying to search for a why, but anyway. So the Conservative Party have obviously had a massive impact on what is taught, in the sense that it was the Conservative Party who brought in the national curriculum in 1988, and have had a significant influence on the education that you see in schools right now, the curriculum that you see in schools right now, by the creation of the 2013 national curriculum, which was a slimming down of that curriculum, and, as Michael Gove would say, focusing on the very best of what has been thought and said. They also increasingly influence what you are taught as new teachers through their early career framework and their core content framework, which in a sense influences the first 3 years of any teacher's new career. So a significant impact on what is taught, both to pupils and to teachers. In terms of how education is structured, well, it's undoubted that the Conservative Party has had a massive impact on education through the process of academisation. We now see 2/3 of all secondary schools as academies, at least 2/3 as academies or part of multi-academy trusts, and that independence and freedom that schools now have is a huge part of secondary school the secondary school educational landscape. There's no denying that that has had a massive impact and will continue to have a massive impact on the system of education of which you are now a part. So undoubted impact there from the Conservative Party, who have picked up actually the Labour Party's initial policy and really run with it. Moving on, the Conservative Party have had a huge impact too on the degree of choice available to parents, in terms of getting into the hands of parents and carers knowledge and information about the effectiveness of schools. And you now, as a parent or a carer, can look at school league tables to actually find out how good a school is on a range of metrics. And those metrics aren't just overall exam outcomes. They are also measures such as progress age and the number of um, students passing EBAC subjects, for example. Um, uh, and that brings with it levels of accountability that perhaps never existed before. And you've obviously also got the entire inspection framework, which was introduced kind of alongside the national curriculum back in the late 80s, early 90s. You've got Ofsted coming in to inspect schools and inspect schools and report on schools' effectiveness, and that surely is an empowering thing for parents and carers who are able to look at to have external metrics to look at the quality of schools. Finally, and let me just move myself out of the way, you've got a significant impact on kind of how teachers are taught and who can come into the teaching profession. So you've got a real, a real plethora of different routes in for different people to come and become teachers. So you've got Teach First, which is looking at well, originally it was set up to take the very best graduates and give them a few years teaching before they went and did something else. They've broadened that out a little bit now, but you've got Now Teach, which focuses on career changes. You've got Troops to Teachers. Actually, that's now defunct, but there's still a University of Brighton-based course which takes troops, former military personnel without degrees, and gives them an undergraduate degree, which then leads to QTS. And you've got various school-based um, uh, routes into teaching, which actually can be pretty similar to PGCs, to be honest. But there's a big diversification, that's the word, of routes into teaching, thinking more broadly about who can become teachers. So that's a summary, in a sense, of Conservative, more recent impact on the educational landscape that we see before us. Okay, let's flip and think about our second protagonist, and that is Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who was born in Geneva in 1712. So he was a Swiss philosopher, and his major work around education came with the publication of Emile, or On Education, in 1762, a very controversial book upon its publication. Um, and the main ideas, and I'm going to distill down the main ideas within this text, were experiential learning. So a child learns far more, far better, far more appropriately through interaction with the real world rather than abstractions of it. So rather than learning, in a sense, secondhand, through books, through maps, through other things. It's about going out into the world and experiencing it. It's about not reading about how to play music, but actually playing a musical instrument, or um, not learning about reading about how to construct an argument, but actually having a debate, actually having an argument. So it's about experiential learning. And Rousseau's big sort of overarching theme is one of freedom, and he argued that for people to be truly free, it's all about reasoning. And if you are able, as a kind of defense mechanism against others who will, outsiders who will look to shape your opinions, and building the ability to reason is your defense against being swayed or beholden to the will or opinion of others. And obviously, that has implications on the role of the teacher in supporting children to learn. Rousseau talked about learners moving through a range of developmental stages, so that reasoning develops according to their context and needs. So moving from concrete to more abstract reasoning. So he suggested that you only start thinking about religious education, for example, later on when you're more able to think about abstract concepts. So there we go. Where are we now? Yeah, I've talked about the role of a teacher. If it is um, about experiential learning, the role of the teacher comes into question about how they guide you through that real world as such. As I've said, it comes into question as to whether or not that teacher should be just providing a core block of knowledge to a young person, or is it more about them tutoring and guiding and facilitating? Um, and you got to think in those ideas. So those ideas of experiential learning, those ideas of what the actual role of a teacher is, and the idea of young people passing through stages. You've got all kinds of different educational theorists that have been influenced by this, and maybe even that can be traced through to some of your actual thought. So you've got John Dewey, you've got Piaget in terms of stages, you've got Freire in terms of questioning the role of a teacher and the the what's it called, the opening up of a of a student's mind, um, and the consumption and regurgitation of a block of knowledge. And these are significant influences on for someone who wasn't just an educational theorist or thinker or philosopher. He thought much more broadly than that. But this is a significant impact on the world of education. But to what degree is it the most significant? That's what you'll be thinking about. Right, I need to move on. So that's Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Let's think now, I'm going to move myself down the corner so I'm not in the way. Let's think now about the impact of the Labour Party. I'm just going to focus on three distinct areas and we're going to go back in time. But in a sense, there's links between all of the three things I'm going to talk about here. So first of all, I mean, you could argue that the Labour Party has transformed the landscape of education. If you go back to the 1940s, the post-war landscape of education was, it was one of really concrete division. You had um, secondary moderns, and you had grammar schools, and you had the 11 plus exam. And as my mother would attest to, you had a whole heap of kids, the majority consigned to uh, a second class education system for those that failed the 11 plus. Those that didn't get into the grammar schools, which took the cream of the crop, those students who could either have the tuition or family support to be able to get through the um, 11 plus and enter grammar school. You get everyone else into secondary moderns, and effectively that is what the concept of comprehensive education, an excellent education for everyone, um, and that actually when learning together everyone learns better. The Labour Party were a huge advocate of and took steps to introduce. So comprehensive schools were um, a product of Labour's interventions. Um, Now, if you actually go back, the second point I want to make is that the antecedents of the Labour Party in terms of education grew to some degree out of the Chartist movement of the 19th century. So the century, in a sense, before the Labour Party really came to being. Um, and interestingly, they were concerned with an education of involving really useful knowledge. It's a knowledge-based education, but interestingly, this was defined as the knowledge that we need to get ourselves out of our present troubles. So it wasn't as a critic of conservative policy would say, well, actually, they are interested in a two-tier system because they think that some people are only good to be given sort of technical skills, know your place knowledge, as you might characterize it. Whereas actually, the Chartist movement were interested in emancipatory knowledge, knowledge that will transform enable you to transform your condition, critique your condition, and surpass it and overcome it. So education is an emancipatory act, and um, you can trace that through to, for example, the 2007 curriculum, which talks much more about citizenship, and much more about educating the whole child rather than um, a more narrow concept of education. Right. Uh, the third point I want to make is bringing, the Labour Party were in power for 13 years between 1997 and 2010. And it's a well-known mantra, Tony Blair's education, education, education um, uh, policy priority. Um, it lead to some real impacts, and not least the schools in which you now teach. A whole host of them saw record investment, and the transformation of the physical, capital infrastructure was hugely transformed under the Labour Party in those 13 years. It was a programme called Building Schools for the Future. And that's transformed the spaces and the aspirations of what educational buildings and spaces could look like. Um, but far more than that, there was a real focus on in an educational sense, and this was a education policy initiative, but Every Child Matters um, drove a lot of the work that the Labour Party and the Department for Education, it wasn't called that at the time, but were doing in schools. So it was thinking again about how to safeguard and protect and encourage and nurture um, the every element of a child, for them to be healthy, stay safe, achieve economic well-being, enjoy and achieve through learning. So it's about enjoyment, it's about economics, but also make a positive contribution to society. So again, those citizenship aspects coming through. Whereas, under present day governmental initiatives, perhaps not all of those elements are promoted. So there's some contributions of the Labour Party. Let's move on. We're going to have one of our contributors talk about the National Education Union tomorrow, and this is the biggest education union in the country. It represents 450,000 teachers and support staff. It's obviously run by its members who go through election to contribute to it at a higher level. They have fought for equal pay for all, so right at the beginning between men and women, um, which is obviously what you see today, that a teacher, no matter their sex or gender, gets the same pay. They offer a huge amount, day in, day out, of individual support and guidance for individual teachers who find themselves in difficult or challenging circumstances, or perhaps without support in a given school. They are there, if that teacher is a member of the NEU, to offer individual support and guidance. They offer, as do all the teaching unions, they offer CPD for teachers, continuing professional development for teachers, all kinds of courses on all kinds of themes, usually not subject specific, but often focused on key issues that you might experience, problems around behaviour, thinking about assessment, etc. They offer, in a sense, the ability to collectively bargain and negotiate with employers on key aspects of working life, health and safety, paying conditions, redundancies, etc. Let me move myself again. Let's move myself to the top. Obviously, they conduct a huge amount of advocacy for teachers and the teaching profession. If you think back to my first ever video, which was about workload and well-being, I quoted some statistics about and some outcomes of research about how teachers feel about their jobs. And part of that research was conducted by the NEU. In its annual teacher survey, they ask about things like that. So they're conducting research on behalf of their teachers and advocating um, and representing teachers to powerful players such as government. Finally, yeah, they conducted a whole host of campaigning for staff and pupil protection during the pandemic. It's really important that we don't ignore the 2 years we're hopefully just coming out the other side of, and the NEU was central in putting the well-being of staff and pupils at the forefront of that. Now, many schools remained open, um, supporting students of key workers, and the educational unions were a key part of establishing how that might happen and the protocols through which everyone can be kept as safe as possible. That lifeline, for example, for kids that really needed it or couldn't get access to appropriate support and education and learning at home, um, the NEU and other educational unions were there fighting for that. So there's a quick summary of the contributions of one of our education unions. You'll hear more at the debate, but hopefully that gets you thinking about what you think about um, what their impact on education has been. We've got a slightly left field contribution here of technology. Um, and this is new for this year, which it's great to have some sort of left field thinking. And in a sense, this is something that we all experience as teachers. Um, and if you think first of all about hardware and software, um, you've got all kinds of, you often plan a lesson supported by PowerPoint. You plan a lesson on a computer. You often use technology in the delivery of lessons. Smart boards, visualizers, all kinds of technology supports the effective teaching of a given lesson. Just the use of video as a stimulus, an image as a stimulus, um, the ability to quickly access and find that resource, that material, that stimulus, and then utilize it, share it with the class, is made so much more accessible through technology. The world, in a sense, is at your fingertips, and surely technology makes it so much easier to share that world with every child um, in a way that just wouldn't be possible if technology wasn't around. And in a sense, you've got to think about education more broadly and how young people now are educated and the degree to which they experience education, um, more so perhaps outside of the classroom, but they experience education through mobile phones and through social media that can often operate on those mobile phones. And that's a huge uh, impact on education made by technology. They also Technology also helps to mitigate parental and carer engagement with education. So you now have educational apps used by schools, which provide almost real-time feedback to parents about a young person's experiences during a day and a young person's uh, educational outcomes on a given day, month, week, year, in a way that it was a closed book school. It was down to what the young person decided to divulge, often not very much, if you're thinking about my case, to their parents or carers when they got home from school at the end of the day. Whereas now that relationship is far more of a triumvirate than ever before, with parents and carers involved in education so much, and that is mediated and made possible through education. Finally, the black box. We can't ignore the role that technology has had in enabling learning to happen throughout the pandemic. One of my nephews is about to sit his no, he's currently sitting his GCSEs, and for a good 2 years, effectively his GCSEs were conducted through a computer screen, and you therefore have to concede and contend that technology has had a massive impact on the education that our young people experience, and particularly have experienced over the last couple of years. So there's some insights into the impact of technology. Finally, we kind of arrive back at ourselves. University-based initial teacher education providers, and uh, let's go for it. Let's talk about some arguments here that might come up in the debate. So obviously PGCEs. Before, when I talked about the Conservative Party right at the beginning, I talked about the diversification of routes, um, and the move to more school-centered uh, initial teacher training, as it might be called, or initial teacher education. But actually, it remains true that most teachers in schools, the vast majority, have actually learned to teach through university-based providers. So that's a huge impact in and of itself. And these providers, the IOE, for example, since 1902, have um, helped to turn teaching into a an actual profession, a status. Hitherto, prior to the kind of university-based initial teacher education beginning, teaching was much more of a profession that you went into if you didn't have other paths to follow, and it meant that you got what you were given in terms of teaching, and teaching wasn't a professionalized force. It was for often for those who kind of babysat children, but might not even have had much interest in children, who wanted to, some of whom wanted to had a um, deficiency view of young people, that they needed to be controlled and tamed, and what have you. So the whole introduction of universities to teacher education, professionalized uh, teaching, gave it status, and it gave it recognition to some degree. And as part of that, we see education becoming and teaching becoming something that isn't just common sense. It requires depth of thought, breadth of experience to marry. Well, how do I teach this particular thing at this particular time to this particular group of young people? Which answers to that question are different every single time, and that's that's the complexity of what teaching is, and that's what ultimately I feel, and hopefully you feel, the PGC can equip you to deal with. It gives you that foundation and that breadth of experience, and those pedagogical possibilities to choose from in order to answer those questions. And the final point on university-based ITE is that it gives you, in a sense, an independent place to choose and make those choices and selections. Because if government is all about prescribing and schools are all about the doing and the application, surely it's that third space, it's universities, where you are much more able, independently of government and schools, to reflect and question uh, both the dogma and prescription of government initiatives, and also the sort of get it done, do it apply it mantra of some schools, actually university gives you the space to reflect and question, um, and gives you a far broader experience. You'll know that a lot of your learning this year has taken place by learning from each other and each other's experience of what might work in given situations, and what have you. And surely without that space, your teaching, the possibilities of your teaching career, the pedagogies and practices of your teaching, um, would be far, far narrower, than we see because you've chosen a university-based route. So there we go. Next step, okay, is for you to think. You'll have been thinking about this all the way through, but who's had the most impact on education in England? That's now what I'm opening the floor to discussion of in your sharing groups. So that's the next step. You're going to have a mini debate in your sharing groups about which of the six here have, in your mind, in your opinion, had the biggest impact on education. Okay, I'm going to stop this video. Thanks very much for watching.